When I first started working as an operations manager, I thought my role was mainly going to be keeping projects on time and helping the administrative work. But as I've grown into the role, I realized that operations can touch so many different areas of a business. Sometimes I'm working on administrative tasks, sometimes I'm working on estimates or processes or helping solving operational problems, or sometimes I'm even working on social media. Actually, a perfect example is this week. At the beginning of the week, I was working on insurance packages, response letters, working on estimates, and focusing on my regular activities or responsibilities. But then today, I end up working on the company's Facebook page. And now I need to start thinking more about a social media strategy. So I think being an operations manager is a little bit more like a chameleon. You have to be able to adapt yourself with a vision according to what the company needs at that moment. And I think that is one of the things that I really enjoy about this role. That every day can be completely different from one another, and that you have to be willing to adapt and figuring out where you can bring the most value. When I first walked into the business, the first thing that I noticed was that there really wasn't much of a structure. A lot of the things weren't written down, there weren't playbooks, manuals, or something that explains how things were supposed to be done. And one of the biggest things that I realized was that a lot of the knowledge was actually living inside my boss's head. They were the ones who knew how things work, so almost everything had to be approved by them or go through them because they were the ones who knew how to do it. And I think that is one of the things that you notice when a company starts growing. You can have really good people working with you. You can really have incredible intentions, but if your processes aren't documented, the business becomes dependent on certain people. So for me, one of the biggest parts of operations has been taking the knowledge that's in people's head and started turning into something that the rest of the team or future team can actually use. Whether it is a process, a playbook, checklist, or just something that is with the things that has to be done. So they don't have to be looking for certain people or asking what I have to do next. I think that's when you start creating a structure, and that actually helps their business to grow. When I first look at how leads come into a company, I look at where they are coming from, but also I look at what happens after that first contact. In the business that I've worked with, a lot of the leads come from phone calls. And I noticed that sometimes the problem isn't getting the lead, it is following up with them constantly. When there are a lot of things happening at the same time, it is very easy to forget about the client who isn't constantly calling or asking for an update. They can be quiet enough that you forget about them and suddenly you realize that you haven't followed them. There were actually a process for handling leads, but it wasn't documented. And it was something that my bosses knew because they had a lot of experience. But they were the only ones that knew what happened next. So if you didn't really know about the process, you had to go and ask them. That's one of the things that really stood up on me about the operations. Having a process isn't enough. If the process only exists in someone's head, it still is very easy for something to fall through the cracks. So when I look at leads now, I'm not just asking where this came from, I'm also wanting to know what is the next step, who's responsible for this project, and how we can make sure that it doesn't get forgotten. When I look at what happens between the first sales conversation and a signed contract, the process usually starts with a phone call. The client tells us what they are looking for, and then we have to make sure that we do that kind of project. If we do, then we schedule the first site visit. During that first visit, we take measurements, document what has to be done, we take notes about the materials or specifics that we need to put into the estimate. After that, the information comes back into the office. Sometimes one of the owners creates the estimate directly, and sometimes the information is sent to me so I can create the estimate and send it back to them for review. Once the estimate is reviewed and approved, then we send it to the client. Then there's another important part. The client needs to agree not just with the estimate, but also on the timing and overall expectations of the project. Once everything is agreed upon, we move into the contract and get it signed. I think one of the places where the processes can slow down is in those handoffs. When information goes from the person who visited the property to the person creating the estimate to the person reviewing it and then finally to the client. The clearer those handoffs are, the easier it is to keep up the process moving and avoid delays. When I look at where fulfillment slowdowns after a customer says yes, I think it really depends on the kind of project we're working on. For retail projects, one of the biggest slowdowns is that material can be delayed. You can have the contract signed, everything planned, and the team ready to go, but if the materials aren't there, then you can't move forward. So sometimes you're basically waiting for something or someone that's outside your immediate control. With insurance projects, the biggest slowdown is usually the approval or payment process. Insurance approvals and payments can take really long time, really long time, and that creates a domino effect because you might know what has to be done and be ready to move forward, but you can necessarily do it until you have the approval or the payment that is coming through. So I think one of the things that I've learned in operations is that fulfillment isn't just about making sure that your own team is doing their job. You also have to understand which part of the process depends on outside parties and plan around those delays as much as you can. Sometimes the work isn't stuck because someone isn't doing something. It's because they're waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to be available. When a process only exists inside one person's head, the biggest problem is that the business becomes dependent on that person. If they're not available, the work can fall behind, and that can actually affect the client's experience. The client might feel desperate or frustrated because they are waiting for something that internally is just waiting for one person. It also creates bottlenecks. If everyone has to go to the same person every time they have a question or need to know what is the next step, that person becomes a place where everything stops. When I look at where responsibilities are unclear or shared between people, I actually don't think that's a major problem in the business. It's a small business, so everyone knows their responsibilities, and we actually do a pretty good job completing each other's work when it's necessary. The bigger challenge here that I've seen is capacity. It's not necessary that people don't know what they are responsible for. It is that sometimes there is simply too much going on someone's plate, and that can slow down the progress of a project. So for me, the solution isn't always about redefining someone's responsibilities. Sometimes it's about looking at everything that this person has to be going on and asking, like, if there is something that I can help, if there is something that can be delegated, or what could be documented so someone else can do this and help them. I think that is an important distinction because when you're working on a small business, people often have to wear multiple hats. The goal isn't necessarily to make sure that everyone's role is extremely rigid. It is to make sure that the workload is manageable and that the business can keep moving even if one person has a lot of going on. When I look at everything that is still open in a company, one of the biggest things that I've noticed is that it isn't necessary that the work is not getting done. Sometimes the work is actually being done, but we don't have a record of it on the CRM. And that becomes a problem when you need to go back and check for something. Maybe you need to know when you contact the client, where the information was sent, or what happened to the project, and there is no record of it. So even though the work happened, from operations perspective, it is almost like information is missing. We also have things that are generally still pending, like emails or estimates that are waiting for approval before they can be sent out. So when I look at an open list, I don't just look at what is unfinished, I also look at the missing information. Because if the CRM doesn't tell you what happened, it is very difficult to know what still needs to be happening. That is something that I learned to pay a lot more of attention to. Making sure that the work gets done is important, but documenting that work is also part of getting that work done. When I look at what happens between finished work and money in the bank, the first step is making sure that the project is actually complete. We send a certificate of completion, and we also have the client to confirm that we are delivering the project according to what they requested and what was agreed upon. After that, it really depends on the type of project. For a retail project, the payment process usually is pretty straightforward, and we don't typically see a very long delay between completing the work and receiving the payment. But with insurance project, it's a different story. Once the work is completed, we have to notify the insurance company about the completion and request the remaining balance. And that part can take really, really long time, sometimes even months. So I think one of the biggest lessons for me is that finishing the physical work doesn't necessarily mean that the project is finished from an operations or a financial perspective. There is still a whole process that needs to be happening, and at the last day of the site, especially with insurance projects, you have to keep following up on with the final project that actually comes in. I think the biggest thing that I've learned is that not everything is going to go as planned. There are always going to be unexpected problems, delays, things that are outside your control, or something that suddenly needs your attention. But if you have a structure in place and you have people who know what is doing or what has to be done and understand this work within that structure, you can reduce a lot of the errors and delays. You can't control everything that happens in a business, but you can control how you prepare and how you can deal with it. I think that's what I've really learned from working in operations. It is not about making everything perfect or making sure that everything never goes wrong. It's about creating enough structure that when something does go wrong, and it will, because it will, you know what you can do next. The right people will know what they are responsible for, and the business can keep moving forward.